Good morning, everybody. How's it going today? I wanted to take some time before Easter to make a little thought for everyone. And what I wanted to do with that is to throw back to some of the things I've been talking about with my students throughout this entire semester. So starting back in January, I started every week having a talk with them about unlikely biblical heroes. And it was a series I was calling in my head just who do you think you are? And the idea has always been there are characters throughout the Bible that they don't fit any idea of what we would now think of as like a good, healthy religious person. Or they've got some other weird problem or fault or issue. So we talked about the Apostle Paul and how he was pretty terrible until he wasn't. We talked about Rahab, somebody who would have a real challenging time being accepted into today's religious culture, but then becomes a hero of all of Israel. We've talked about Mary Magdalene, someone who, again, would have been thrown out and cast aside, but somebody who was so valuable to Jesus that she was the first one who saw him after he raised from the dead. And we did others as well. And so I wanted to kind of cap off that series today and link it back up with Easter. Now, we already did Mary, and like I said, she's the first one who saw Jesus after he raised from the dead, and that would be a good one to end with as well. But instead, I want to do a character that shows up even a little bit later. I want to talk about Thomas today. Thomas is one of the disciples, and I feel like most of the time he gets a pretty bad rap for, being the doubting one, the one who didn't have enough faith to see things for what they really were. And I think we do this with a few disciples. We do it with Peter, absolutely. Peter is always kind of picked on as like, oh, he thought it was weird that he would drown by walking on water. Well, of course he thought he would drown because he was walking on water and no one had ever done that before. So we give some of these disciples a really hard time and we tell them you should have known better and what was wrong with you and why wasn't your faith stronger. And I think we get that with Thomas as well. So Thomas's main story, the reason we think about him and the way we connect him to doubt comes after the resurrection. So Jesus is arrested, he's tried, he's convicted, he's crucified, he's put in a tomb, and he comes back out of that tomb. And that's what people celebrate this weekend on Easter. I want to celebrate something else today, though, with Thomas. After Jesus rises from the dead and he visits and sees a number of people who were his followers and were his friends and people who loved him, Thomas was not with those people. And so by the time word gets to Thomas that Jesus is alive, Thomas is skeptical. And as I said before, I think we give him sometimes a really hard time, but I don't know if it's really fair to do that. Here's why I think that. Thomas knew Jesus just like any of the other disciples. We presume that he walked with Jesus for 3 full years, learning from him, hearing his teachings, loving everything about it. But Thomas, just like all the disciples, also saw Jesus die. He was there when Jesus was arrested. He would have known what happened. He would have been a witness to some capacity, like Jesus is not possibly alive. And we know that. Thomas is a guy who looks at experience and puts his faith in what he can see. And again, I think we usually give people a really hard time for that. We say that they don't have enough faith or that they're somehow weak because they need evidence for their belief. But what I love about the story of Thomas is when it really comes down to it, that's not really the message that we get. So Thomas is hanging out with a bunch of the disciples, and they've been telling him Jesus is alive. He is alive. And Thomas says, no, it can't be. It's not possible. And they say, but it is possible. And he's like, unless I can see the guy, unless I can touch him and see the wounds in his hands and have the evidence before me, how do you expect me to believe this stuff? You sound crazy. And then out of nowhere, Jesus arrives. He shows up. Nobody knows from where. He's just there. And Thomas, of course, instantly is moved. He is flustered and probably not sure what to do. But what Jesus does in this moment is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire Bible, because Jesus tells Thomas, come on over. You need the evidence, you need the proof. It's right here. Check it out. And instead of showing up and telling Thomas, dude, come on, faith, man, mustard seeds, why? You really messed this one up. That's not Jesus' attitude. Jesus' attitude is, you needed evidence. You needed some kind of thing to see, some kind of experience for you to get your mind in this kind of position to accept this reality. Cool. Here's that experience. There's a lot of us who are like Thomas because we want evidence, and it makes sense. We only know our experience at any given time. When someone tells you that something's going on in the world, but if you haven't experienced that thing, you can't possibly fathom what that's like. You can't possibly believe that it's really like that. If you think about some of the worst things that have happened on this planet, and if you think about the first time you heard about it, like the first time you heard that, there are genocides happening right now. There are hundreds of thousands of people being exterminated right now. It's easy to forget that because that's not a part of our daily experience. We don't walk through our lives just looking left and right and be like, oh, hey, people are dying all over the place. Instead, for most people that I know, and most people who live a pretty privileged life in the United States, we walk through our lives and say, life is good. God is good. Things are great. And so when we say that we believe in a good God and a loving God, it's because a lot of us have pretty good lives. And so the narrative, the idea of a good, loving God matches up with our lives that are they're going pretty well. But what Thomas shows us is a different perspective, which is, how do you possibly believe in something that, according to your own experience, seems impossible? Thomas is a guy who watched a friend of his get taken, arrested, and killed. And he's told by the people around him, hey, your friend isn't actually dead, he's alive. Well, of course, Thomas wouldn't believe it. He would have been grieving. He still would have been in shock, probably. He would have had a monumental task to try to accept a reality like that. So when Jesus enters the room, he doesn't yell at Thomas. He doesn't condemn him. He doesn't do some weird passive-aggressive mind game like, oh, you just didn't think I'd be able to do that? You know, I talked about it, right? I said in 3 days this temple will be risen up. Like I told you. You don't remember that? He didn't do any of that because Jesus isn't a jerk. Jesus is love personified. Growing up in the church, there's a lot of phrases you hear, and one of them is accepting people where they are. It's a wonderful, beautiful idea. And as human beings, we're usually pretty bad at doing that. We're not always good at accepting people as they are, accepting them with their faults and their problems and their shortcomings and their disbelief. We're terrible at it. But what we learn from Jesus in the story of Thomas is Jesus is great at it. He has an understanding for people who need something more. And so when we think about Easter and we think about the Gospels and we think about what we have to be hopeful about, there's so much to look at. For some people, the hope of Easter is that death isn't the end. Super hopeful. But with Thomas, there's something else that's hopeful, which is when we have moments of doubt, when we have moments of frustration, the true hope is that Christ understands that struggle. Christ shows up and says, it's okay. He tells Thomas, you saw and now you believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and still believe. So there's room for all ranges of faith in this story. If you are in a position right now in this crazy chaotic time where we are all stuck in our houses, that we don't know where the world is taking us, where over 1 million people across the globe have a disease that is killing tens of thousands of people, it makes sense that we might be a little bit on the doubting side about the goodness and the hope for humanity and for everyone in our world. But what Easter shows us is in the face of death, when someone is fearful, or if somebody can't see past this struggle and past this trial, Christ understands that. And he says some people need a little bit more to believe. And he doesn't condemn that. He does go further and say, if you can believe without seeing, awesome. Awesome. That's great. But what I want to think about this year for Easter, and what I want to hang on to, and the hope that I want to not just claim for myself, but extend with compassion and love to other people, is that not everybody sees the world the way I see it. They might need to see some kind of evidence or some kind of perspective, or maybe I need to see that perspective and I need to see that evidence to line up my views with somebody else or with something greater than what I am. And the story of Thomas tells us that's okay. That's the power of love. That's the power of God's love, is that you can be anywhere, in any circumstance, with anything going on in your life, and you might be thinking, I've got nothing. I can't possibly believe in this right now. This is impossible. Maybe it's a message about how worthy you are. There's a lot of people right now struggling with their mental health, about what they're worth. There are people who are losing their jobs and wondering, what can I do with my life? How can I provide for the people I love? These are pretty hopeless times for a lot of people. And the story of Thomas teaches us that it's okay to worry, to wonder, to be scared. And it also teaches us that in those moments, Christ shows up in the room with us. That he says, I understand that you're having a hard time right now. I get it. Some of you need to see something bigger and greater to believe. So what I ask of all of you at this time, how can you be the evidence? How can you be the vessel that shows that there is still hope in the world? How can you reach out to people right now who are most hopeless? The people who are struggling right now, who need to see someone, who need to communicate with someone, who need to know that they're valuable and they're worthy and that they are loved and they're not forgotten even though they're locked away in their home somewhere. Christ appeared before Thomas and gave him hope in the face of something impossible. This Easter, I want all of us to do the same thing for someone.